All right, ladies, this screencast is going to kind of pick up with the conclusion of the Fugitive Slave Act because I was kind of rushed on the response to the Fugitive Slave Act in the previous screencast. Obviously, the Fugitive Slave Act is very controversial, and so people, particularly in the North, even more so abolitionists, are not very happy about the passage of the act. They do see it as the government protecting slavery. You do see like an increased number of slaves actually captured and brought back into the South once it was passed. But you do have some more radical abolitionists challenging this law even further and just disobeying it outright and continuing to help resist and assist slaves get into free states. A lot of the reason for the pushback here is the popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin. We kind of introduced Harriet Beecher Stowe's book already, but because this book is becoming more prominent and just popular in the northern states, it really is showing the egregiousness that is slavery. Thus, people are not wanting to send slaves back into that type of environment and hostile, situation. So you do still see some pushback from it, but it's a very divisive law overall. Okay, well, we're going to now move on into further examples of sectionalism kind of causing conflict politically. And the first example of this is going to be the KansasNebraska Act, which was passed a few years after the Compromise of 1850. If you kind of recall with the Compromise of 1850, I know I had spouted out a bunch of parts of the compromise, including, California becoming a free territory, a free state, sorry. But one of the things that compromise also did was that it said that within the New Mexico and Utah territories, popular sovereignty would be used to determine whether or not there would be slavery allowed in those territories and states. Those two territories were not initially part of like the Louisiana Purchase, which is all we had when the Missouri Compromise line was established. If you kind of recall, the Missouri Compromise line said that no states above or below, above the line could be open to slavery. But it didn't really apply to, Utah and New Mexico, since that's like an additional piece of land. People could argue that, well, that wasn't part of the country when we made that initial agreement, so we don't want the line to apply there. So that's why popular sovereignty was granted in those territories. The problem is that the Nebraska territory, and you can actually see what that actually is at the time. Like, think like present day, like Montana, Dakotas, into Nebraska, into Kansas. It's not just currently the Nebraska state, but if you kind of see those territories there, they are very clearly above the Missouri Compromise line, and they were part of the Louisiana Purchase, so at least most of it was. Thus, it should automatically be closed to slavery, but because residents living in Nebraska see that Utah and New Mexico now get to decide whether or not they want to allow slavery by a popular vote, they want that same opportunity, okay? So you have Stephen Douglas, who we'll introduce a good bit later. Stephen Douglas was a senator from Illinois. He's a Democrat. Just keep in mind that Democrats are not always Southern, as Illinois is not in the South, but you have a larger number of Democrats in the South, so they typically are Southern sympathizers in some cases anyway. But anyway, Stephen Douglas is going to introduce a bill in Congress that would divide the Nebraska territory into two different parts, Nebraska in the north and Kansas in the south, kind of creating two different lines and territories here, and to allow popular sovereignty to determine slavery in both territories. The reason for this is that the Nebraska territory was quite large. Initially, you see it's much larger than it even is today as a state, but the whole premise is that there was less people living on the northern side of that line. If they divided the whole territory, though, in half, that would then allow for like double the chance. For example, it was a way to kind of get the North on board, like it's not going to be all one way or nothing. Perhaps, yes, like Kansas would go and legalize slavery, but then perhaps Nebraska wouldn't, and then it would still maintain like an even balanced system. Whereas if the whole territory went one way, then the other side's going to be really upset. So I think he does this as a way to kind of ease tensions. The debate over this bill to like divide, Nebraska and Kansas and to allow popular sovereignty was very, fierce. It was a very controversial bill because the North kind of just sees this as part of the South's plot to like turn this into more slave states. And the South, of course, is all for it because it's a better opportunity for them to increase their agenda. And again, kind of recall the fact that like with sectionalism, y'all, it's not just about, oh, we want more slaves, or we don't want more. It's about getting your way. So like the South and the North are so divided at this point, and they both want to maintain that kind of top dog in control status. And if the other side begins to outnumber them, they feel they're losing their voice. And if they lose their voice, then their way could be overturned. And so it is a very deep, rooted issue and debate. But eventually, after several months of struggle, the KansasNebraska Act was passed. And this will effectively repeal the Missouri Compromise line, because the Missouri Compromise line is basically now obsolete because all the territory above the line is no longer close to slavery. People can vote on it. That means that it doesn't apply anymore. Well, things are going to get quite violent in Kansas. Okay, the drama doesn't stop there with the act. Basically, Kansas is more populated at this point than the Nebraska, the Northern Territory, was. So that will be the first one that gets to decide on whether or not it's a free or slave state, since it's now based on popular vote. Again, just to reiterate what popular sovereignty means, it means like the residents living in a certain territory, in a certain region, will get to vote on a matter and decide whether or not they want to allow slavery or to ban it. Okay? The race is basically on in Kansas to see which side can populate it the fastest with the most supporters, because whoever has the most supporters living in Kansas, they will likely vote that way. Once there were enough settlers in the Kansas territory to organize a government, the territory did hold elections. However, on election day, and just like throughout, I guess there might have been multiple days for elections back then, but thousands of people that lived not in Kansas but in Missouri actually streamed across the border and voted illegally in favor of slavery. And that's illegal. Keep in mind that, some of you may have like gone with your parents to vote recently. It didn't work the same way back then that it does today. It's not as secure. You don't have like photo identification and things like that. So people are illegally, accessing ballots, voting for issues that they're not even allowed to vote for because it's not within their territory or state. Abolitionists know that this is happening. And so basically a full-on riots like break out in Kansas between like the pro-abolitionist, political leaders, the government, and the pro-slavery government, because they're, the pro-slave government is saying that they won fair and square. The abolitionists know that fraud's taken place, and there is like an all-out, death riot. I mean, people are dying. It's just incredible, like the lengths that, which things are going, in, Kansas, and like with this issue of slavery, how deep, the roots are running and how much people are fighting over it. And the fighting does not stop there. The last kind of idea I want to talk about today is the violence that will break out in the Senate. Kind of in response to some of what's happening in the states. This is like the U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress. In May, just a little bit after, you don't have to know the date actually, but it's 1855, just for perspective. Civil War ends in 10 years, it starts in 5. Charles Sumner, I have these names on the screen, by the way. He is a senator from Massachusetts, think like Northeast New England. And he will give a very impassioned speech in the Senate that was entitled "The Crime Against Kansas." And for basically like 2 days, he will verbally attack the South. He will verbally attack slavery. He will call out what happened in the case of Kansas, and the violence that has like ensued there. He will specifically single out a South Carolinian senator by the name of Andrew Butler for his pro-slavery beliefs, calling him, just basically criticizing his beliefs and criticizing his politics and his morality, really, for his slaveholding practices. But with this public bashing, verbal assault on Butler has a nephew who is a congressman, so a representative, who is witnessing some of these, talks and rants. And that nephew is Congressman Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks will walk into the Senate chamber and he will strike Sumner on the head repeatedly with a cane until the cane broke. This is known as the caning of Charles Sumner. Okay, so there's like physical fights happening in Congress, like over the issue of slavery, which is really horrific overall. Sumner actually himself suffered brain damage and didn't even return to his Senate seat for more than 3 years. So this just shows really how tensions between the North and the South are pretty much like at an all-time high. But there are still a few other things that are going to change, like before, and things are going to get worse in some ways politically, involving party politics actually, before too long now. Okay, if you have any questions about this, please write them down. We will be moving on tomorrow to really make efforts to conclude the chapter overall. Okay, I hope you'll have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.